14 persons, the chiefest from whom was called Stephen, burned as heretics for the testimony of the truth by the papists at Orleans in France near the close of AD 1022. AD 1022, near the close of the year, it seems, or at the least AD 1023, there were apprehended and publicly burned in France, in the presence of King Robert, on account of heresy, so called by the papists, certain 14 persons, some of whom were common people, while the others were of noble descent. Footnote, laymen and nobles, etc., the papist writer says, and of whom the chiefest was called Stephen. They were accused of having spoken evil of God and holy sacraments, that is, of holy baptism, namely infant baptism, for this was what the papists generally practiced, and concerning which disputes were of frequent occurrence, and of the body and blood of the Lord, that is, the sacrament of the altar, which the Romanists were wont to call the body and blood of the Lord, also of marriage, etc. This appears, says the writer, to have been the first execution, that is, by burning, of persons accused of heresy in the Roman Church. Continuing, he says, in an old book we find an account that this heresy was brought into this country from across the sea, namely from Bulgaria, and that thence it was spread into other provinces, where it subsequently was much in vogue, principally in Languedoc, around Toulouse, and Gascony. He also states there that the people who maintained this doctrine were called Albigeois, and also Bulgarians, because they came from Bulgaria. Touching the accusations which were brought against the aforementioned 14 persons, they were, as is related, that they had spoken against this article concerning God, against the holy sacraments, both baptism and the sacrament of the altar, against marriage, etc., on account of which there was inflicted upon them the very cruel, dreadful, and miserable death by fire. But what they delivered and maintained with regard to said points, according to the account of impartial writers, shall be amply explained afterwards in the confession of the Albigenses and Waldenses, who held the same belief, since said persons are held to have been the firstlings of those who maintained the doctrine of the Albigenses, though long before their general rising. Then it will be seen that they believed and spoke nothing but what we at the present day believe and speak. Also, as regards to baptism, that they baptized believers and opposed infant baptism, and touching the supper, that they observed it according to the institution of Christ, but rejected the Mass and transubstantiation. Again, that they denied revenge, the swearing of oaths, auricular confession, the invocation of departed saints, purgatory, etc. Further observations touching said 14 martyrs, according to the accounts of various papistic and other writers, noted in A. Millenis's second book on the persecutions. Robert Altisidorensis states of said martyrs of Orleans that they were of the best or chiefest laymen of Orleans, and that for this reason a council was convened there against them, in which they were unanimously condemned and sentenced as heretics to the fire, and that they were thus burned alive. This testimony is confirmed by Johannes, a monk of Floriax, who gives a somewhat fuller account of the matter in his letter to Olivia, or Olivarius, abbot of the church of Ansona, saying, "Meanwhile I will inform thee of this heresy," thus he calls the true faith of these people, which was on Innocents' Day in the city of Orleans, for it is the truth if thou hast heard aught of it. King Robert caused 14 of the best or most nobly born laymen of said city to be burned alive, who, oh what a great falsehood, abominable before God, and hated by heaven and earth, utterly denied the grace of holy baptism. He means infant baptism, for thereupon the grace of salvation was promised to children, which these men denied, as well as the consecration of the body and blood of the Lord, and denied that one could thereby obtain remission of sins after he had committed a crime. Glaber Radulfus gives a much more circumstantial account of these martyrs, relating not only how this so-called heresy was discovered, but also how it was brought to Orleans and propagated, which we, in order to be brief, pass by. He mentions among others 2 of these people by name, namely Heribert and Lisui, who were greatly esteemed and beloved by the king and the lords of the realm, as long as their case was not known. Glaber further relates how they were discovered. They sought, at Rouen, to bring a certain priest over to their belief, through some whom they probably had expressly sent to this priest to expound to him the mystery of their doctrine, and who endeavored to persuade him by saying that very soon all the people would fall over to them. When the priest understood this, he immediately went to Richard, the count of that city, and told him the whole matter. The latter instantly sent letters by express messengers to the king, informing him of this secret pestilence, as he calls the true faith. King Robert, much grieved at this, without delay convened a council of many bishops, abbots, and other religious persons, thus he calls this bloodthirsty council, and through them caused very strict strict investigations to be made, both as to the authors and adherents of said heresy, when inquiry was made among the laymen as to what the belief and faith of each several one was, the aforesaid Heribert and Lisui immediately discovered themselves that they differed in their belief from the Roman Church, and afterwards others also declared that they adhered to Heribert and Lisui, and that they could in no wise be drawn away from their faith. Being interrogated more closely whence and by whom this presumption had originated, they gave this answer: "This is what you've long called a sect, which you now, though late, recognize. But we have waited for a long time that you, as well as others of whatever law or order, might come over and unite with this sect, which, we also believe, will yet take place." They then immediately presented their belief undoubtedly after the manner of the Albigenses and Waldenses, as shall be shown hereafter. When the king and all those present saw that they could not be moved from their belief, he commanded that a very large fire of wood should be kindled not far from the city, in order that perhaps, terrified thereby, they might desist from their belief. But when they were about to be led out to the fire, they cried aloud, saying that they greatly longed for it, and gave themselves into the hands of those who were to draw them to the fire. They, 13 in number, were committed to the flames, and all who afterwards were found to be their adherents were put to death by the same means. Again, in the records of the parish church of Orleans, called St. Maximus's Church, the time is specified when this took place. It occurred, it is there stated publicly, at Orleans, A.D. 1022, in the 28th year of King Robert, on the 5th induction, when the arch-heretic Stephen and his companions were condemned at Orleans and burnt. The above citations are taken from the writings of papists, hence the reader is admonished to judge charitably with regard to the accusations which these inveterate adversaries have so bitterly cast up against the pious witnesses of Jesus Christ. Note: we've related above that said 14 martyrs have been considered by the ancients as the firstlings of the Waldenses, but the papists called them heretics. However, this is not to be wondered at, since in the course of time they adopted the practice of calling heretics and the Waldenses by the same name. Of this we will present a few examples. The priest Rhinarius wrote a book which he called Summa contra Hereticos, that is, a summary against the heretics. To this book the Jesuits subsequently gave the title Contra Waldenses, or Against the Waldenses, as if all the errors opposed in said book were peculiar to the Waldenses, which is untrue as falsehood itself. Everhard Berthuniensis gave to his book the title Anti-Heretism, which is equivalent to saying against heretics, etc., but the Jesuit Gretserus, when he published said book, called it Everhardus contra Waldensen, as if Everhard had written only against the Waldenses, notwithstanding only the smallest part militates against them. Nevertheless, it was sought by this title to accuse the poor Waldenses of all the heresies mentioned in the book. Afterwards, the Ermengarde wrote a book against the grossly erring spirits who maintained in their confession that the world and all visible things were not created by God. Oh, what an awful falsehood! But by Satan, which belief is imputed by most of the ancient writers to the Manichaeans. Yet the last-mentioned falsifier, namely Gretserus, has not hesitated to head such a page of said book, Ermengarde against the Waldenses, though the author specifically refuted the Manichaeans, with whom the Waldenses had nothing in common. See the above-mentioned authors and books, and also the comments of Balthazar Lydius on the disputations of said persons. Hence it follows from foregoing that it need not seem strange to the reader that the papists called the orthodox Waldenses, or at least such as opposed the Roman doctrine, as well as the priests and monks, by the odious name of Manichaeans, or heretics, as was frequently the case, and shall presently be shown with regard to the good martyrs who, through the malice of the papists, were hanged at Goslar.